Bueno, vamos con la tercera charla de hoy, que correrá a cargo de Brecht Arnaert. Él fue alumno del máster de Jesús Huerta de Soto también. Nos hablará sobre negative interest rates, the Nemesis of time preference theory.
Buenos días. Mi castellano es aún peor que ella, entonces me permites que hablo en inglés. Sí. First of all, I want to thank Dr. Rayo for the invitation. Because I have a theory that is a bit, crazy. And the theory actually is that time preference is not the explanation for interest. So anybody who would try and say that, they would immediately, say you don't have to come to class anymore because that's the core of our interest theory. And to make my point, I have to tread very lightly and to show that at least one thing is not able to be explained by the present standard Austrian interest theory, and that is the phenomenon of negative interest rates. The problem with negative interest rates, I think, is quite obvious, that we are entering an absurd territory where capitalists actually pay people to borrow money. So in Belgium, there are about 1,000 people who have a mortgage on their house, and they had a variable mortgage. It went below zero, and now the bank is paying them every month on their current account. So how this can be profitable for banks, or how this can last very long, I don't know. What I do want to know is what explains this behavior, or what explains this phenomenon praxeologically. And so, how do I try to prove that? I have to have a method. The problem, theoretically, the practical problem is that people have to, that capitalists have to pay money for people willing to lend. The theoretical problem is that time preference, which is the main aspect of interest theory, can only be positive. So Mises said, man pursues goals, and there's a temporal gap between the two, so all entrepreneurial action, all human action is directed towards the future. And it was actually Rothbard who quantified that idea in Man, Economy and State, and he said a high time preference, so people want preferring goods in the present more than in the future, will charge a high interest rate, and people with a low time preference will charge a low interest rate. Okay, so, and for 50 years, since 1962, we have accepted this explanation, but now, there is a problem, because there are also three other components to the interest theory, and they conflict. So the goal of my presentation is not to prove another theory, I just want to prove that the problem is valid. If we are agreeing on a validity of a problem, we can start searching for solutions. But first I have to be sure that I'm not chasing castles in the sky. So how do I prove that there is a problem? There you see the four aspects of interest theory, standard interest theory. First, of course, the red man, that is time preference. This is the most important explanation. But Mises identified two more factors, and Rothbard even identified a fourth factor. So the second factor, according to Mises, was the entrepreneurial factor, which accounts for risk. An entrepreneur that is confronted with two options to lend will charge more if he sees more risk. Then there's the price premium. If an entrepreneur or a capitalist expects inflation, he will charge a bit more to be sure that the loss of purchasing power is compensated. And then the fourth aspect, which was added by Rothbard, is the terms of trade component. And this is the most difficult one, but it has to do with the fact that when you have inflation, that consumer prices, the selling prices of your manufactured goods, rise more rapidly than the factors you are using to produce them. So the entrepreneur buys wheat, water, and yeast, and he makes bread, so the bread rises faster than his factors of production, so there's a profit there. So those are the four only ways that interest is explained by Austrian standard theory. So what do I do to prove it? Well, I just negate those three factors and I see if they are factually possible, if it can be negated. And I hope to isolate the source of negative interest rates. We are sure it cannot be time preference, so it has to be from one of those other three. So time preference, we don't have to say much about it really, because it can only be positive. It can be left out as a source. So I put a green thingy there to be sure that this is not the thing. Now, entrepreneurial risk. Again, what is that? In essence, that entrepreneurs want a higher pay to take a higher risk. Okay, let's negate that. That is, entrepreneurs want a lower pay for less risk. That's the full negation. There are two quantors. There's wanting more pay for more risk. We negate both of them. And what do we arrive at? Do we arrive at an explanation of negative interest? Or no, we arrive at a truism, namely that if there's less risk, they will charge less. Okay, where's negative interest? But even if we relax the negation by only denying one quantor, that they want a lower pay for the same risk, so not even a lower pay for lesser risk, but a lower pay for the same risk, well, this is catalactically impossible. And I want to stress catalactically impossible. It happens today, but catalactics is the study of exchange between two people isolated. So if you take two entrepreneurs and you presume that they want to make a profit, when will they exchange values? That is catalactics. So while it is true that some entrepreneurs would be willing to accept a lower pay for the same risk, for instance, because they have no alternative, catalactically, if they would be free to do so, they wouldn't. It's not that they desire to make a loss. This is a very important point. So what are we faced with? If we try to negate the entrepreneurial factor into negative entrepreneurial risk, either we arrive at a truism that if risk drops, they won't charge as much, okay? Or we arrive at something that is possible only under circumstances where there is a central bank or some institution forcing them. But this is an analysis we can only make after we have explained interest rates in a free market. You cannot, you have to think about the free market and then you introduce factors that lower or that change the normal behavior of people. So my conclusion is that the entrepreneurial risk component is not, well, we can negate it, but only under certain circumstances. So it is positive. Then let's look at the price premium. So the price premium, again, is that capitalists charge an extra premium when they expect inflation. So if we negate that, it would mean that capitalists actually pay a premium if they expect deflation. If they expect that prices are going to drop, so the purchasing power of their money is going to rise, that would be the only way in which they would pay an extra premium. So what is happening today, pay people to lend, that would be then negative interest. But one of the most obvious questions you can ask is, if he's so sure about deflation, then why would he even bother to lend out his money? He's taking a great risk by lending out if he expects that the supply of money is going to contract, because to repay a loan under deflationary pressure is much harder. The loan was taken out when there was a lot of money, the money supply is dwindling, and so everybody's chasing for the same money to repay the loans when there was a lot of money. So that's actually what's happening now in South America. That's what Brazil is facing. So the question is, why would I take such a risk as an entrepreneur if I can just sit back and reap a riskless profit of my liquidity that is going up in purchasing power? I think that is a valid entrepreneurial question. Why would they do that? So it presupposes this component, to make it negative, it presupposes a capitalist willing to pay money to take extra risk. Not to take less risk or the same risk, but extra risk, because when deflation comes, you will have an enormous liquidity problem. Nobody will have the money to pay back loans, so the risk is enormous, and he wants to pay for that. Okay, if this is the source of negative interest rates, I'm fine with it, but I think it's a pretty hard assumption to maintain. And then we get to the last component, and that is the terms of trade component. So entrepreneurs, a baker. Let's imagine a baker baking bread, and what does he see? That the price of the bread he's trying to sell, so the market price of bread is rising, normally is rising, and his factors are rising too, but less fast. So in the difference in the spread he makes a profit. I think it's a bit typical for Rothbard to find these little things. I don't think it's a big explanatory factor, but it's a factor. So if we negate that, if we take the obverse, the negation would be that the price of bread drops, but that the price of the factors he needs to produce the bread drop less fast. So he's constantly selling while his margins are dwindling. So he keeps baking bread every month, he's keeping baking bread, the price he can charge goes lower and lower. His factors, the water and the yeast and everything, is dropping as well, but it drops less fast. Okay, so you are confronted with an entrepreneurial question. So the summary is, the first two factors cannot be negative, and the last two factors can be negative, but this is not yet, but only under very unplausible assumptions. So, but this is not proof yet. When does proof come? Well, the factors I mentioned was that in the case of the terms of trade component, at a certain given time, the entrepreneurial component will come about. The baker will say, you know, I will not continue baking bread, so I'm out of this market. So if we want to keep the terms of trade component negative, theoretically, we cannot have an entrepreneurial action, because that would, you know, remove the baker from the equation. So these components cannot coincide together. They contradict each other if you want to keep them negative at the same time. Same goes for the price premium component. This capitalist, even though he would be earning more money just by keeping liquidity and waiting for deflation, he cannot get out of this market if we want to keep the price premium component negative. So this is another conflict. And so what is the conclusion, to my mind, and I present it to the public, that if we want to keep the entrepreneur as being an entrepreneur, as being able to take decisions that change the course that is not predicted by the model, then we have to assume that the terms of trade and the price premium cannot be negative. If we want to keep them negative, we can, but only under the assumption that there is no entrepreneurial action trying to avoid losses. So what is the conclusion? In my mind, the third and the fourth cannot be negative if and only if we want to let the entrepreneur be an entrepreneur. And so my conclusion is the standard Austrian interest theory cannot explain negative interest if we want to maintain the entrepreneur. And I would say that for any theory of human action, we would have to safeguard in our models of explanation the function of the entrepreneur. I thank you.